Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. This is Iris Gilbert-Glick, Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy at GLI. And thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. And a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Babbage co-founder, who we will hear more from in just a few moments. Getting a little bit of background noise, I'm going to try my best to improve our audio here. Just a friendly reminder to mute your individual lines. One of our top goals here at GLI is to promote healthy civic engagement. While we are a nonpartisan organization and we do not endorse candidates for elected office, we strongly encourage our members to vote, and we work diligently to keep them informed about the electoral process. This election cycle is, of course, a bit more complicated than usual, which is why we are thrilled to have with us today Secretary of State Michael Adams to walk us through how voting will work in Kentucky during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I hand things over to our presenting sponsor, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. First, our call will last approximately 30 minutes. So please remain muted with your video off for the duration of the call, and this will help kind of reduce some of the distractions and cut some of the background noise. We will try to reserve some time for Q&A towards the end of the call, which I will help facilitate. Please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit a question for Secretary Adams. With that, I will now turn things over to our presenting sponsor, and I should add, former Kentucky Secretary of State, Bob Babbage of Babbage co-founder.
Thank you, Iris. It's great to be here today and a privilege to introduce the Honorable Michael Adams. He grew up in Paducah, Kentucky, went to U of L as a McConnell sponsor, a McConnell scholar, excuse me, Harvard Law School, cloaked for the noted federal judge John Habern, was Deputy General Counsel to Governor Fletcher, then counsel to the U.S. Deputy Attorney General significantly, and counsel to the Republican Governors Association, a lot of major roles, and then legal counsel to Vice President Pence. He was appointed a year ago to the Board of Elections, or shortly around that time, by Governor Bevin, and came all the way full circle to be our Secretary of State. No Secretary of State has ever faced a challenge quite like this. Every Secretary of State, pretty much in a row since before me, the legendary Bremer Earler, we've all tried to help each other and back each other up. Our team, that's Julie Babbage in Louisville and Washington, Dr. Rebecca Hertzo in Lexington, Lauren Hogan in Frankfurt, and admire greatly the work that Secretary Adams and Governor Beshear have done to pull together a plan to make this happen. So it's certainly an honor to introduce our outstanding Secretary of State, Michael Adams.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you for attending today. GLI and Iris, thank you for putting this on. And Bob, thank you for sponsoring, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'll just kick it off and tell you at the outset, there are 4 ways to vote in this election. Number 1, you can vote in person on election day. It's not your best option. It's going to be very time consuming, potentially out in the summer heat, but you can do that if you must or if you choose. You can vote in person on election day 6 to 6, or you can vote in person early by making an appointment with your county clerk. Appointments are suggested so we can reduce the crowds at the polling site of the clerk's office, which is not really designed for social distancing. Number 3, you can vote in person absentee, which is to say you can request an absentee ballot at govoteky.com or from your county clerk, and then fill it out at home and then mail it back. You can hand deliver it to the county clerk. We've got secure drop boxes for all the county clerks under continuous supervision. So you can hand deliver your ballot and feel confident that it's arrived and will be counted. Or, of course, you can mail it back, postage prepaid. We're paying for the postage. So there are 4 ways to vote: in-person election day, in-person early, in-person with your absentee ballot, or absentee ballot by mail. So just a bit of context. I think everyone knows well now, coronavirus has made the sort of accommodations necessary, like what we're seeing today. You all have accommodated reality by offering a different approach so that you can gather and convene and get information. We had to do the same thing in our elections. Governor Beshear and I, back in early March, it just never occurred to us that we'd be in this sort of position. We made a decision on March 16th to act jointly under our emergency powers set forth by law to delay the election from May 19th to June 23rd. Our hope at that time was that coronavirus would go away before the election. Obviously, it hasn't. So the other benefit of that delay was giving us time to run the logistics of how to have an election under these circumstances. The governor and I disagree on a number of items, but what we agreed on is the same goals. Number one, how do we keep people safe? How do we keep from risking people's lives unnecessarily? But also, how do we keep Mother Nature from disenfranchising anybody and exercising the right to vote? So we had common goals. We spent several weeks negotiating. Eventually, we came up with the agreement in late April that is now set forth. I want to reassure all of you, I do get a lot of criticism that we've taken people's rights away. Nothing could be further from the truth. We've actually made voting easier. Election day is in our state constitution. Our state constitution requires elections be held, quote, at the polls. We're still going to have polls. We're still going to have in-person voting. But our state constitution also explicitly provides for absentee voting, literally mail-in voting. It's in our state constitution too. A lot of folks don't realize that. And so we've made that easier. We haven't created it, we've simply made it easier. The easiest way to vote, the most considerate way to vote, considerate of other voters, considerate of our poll workers who are stretched really thin, is to go to govoteky.com and request an absentee ballot, which you can either mail back or hand deliver. This portal that we launched, the governor and I, on Friday evening, has already been used well over 100,000 times successfully. Those ballots are now going out. Absentee balloting is not a new facet of Kentucky law or policy. We've had absentee balloting for many years. Actually, I typically have voted absentee ballot by mail. I'm typically traveling on election day. And so I've utilized it. It's safe, it's secure. Your vote is kept secret. This is required by our Constitution. We've got processes in place to verify identity before a voter is issued one of these ballots, and also to verify the accuracy of the identity of the returned vote. We compare signatures between the signed ballot envelope that's returned and the voter signature of record. No one is more sensitive to the issue of election fraud than I am, but I can assure you that this system both makes it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Just one last point, and then I want to certainly take all the questions you may have. You know what, I'll come back to this point later. I'll take your questions first. Thanks.
Keeping us guessing. Thank you, Secretary Adams. And we're just going to jump right into it. Before I get to my first question, though, would like to remind all of our participants today to utilize the chat feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and feel free to type out a question and our staff will get to you. So Secretary Adams, we know that there's been some coverage regarding some of the projections, voter turnout projections and how many ballots have been requested thus far. Has your office sort of been able to develop any further voter turnout projections for this primary? Any sort of trends that you can share with us today?
Well, we're not in a position yet where we can make a final projection about the turnout. Here's what I can tell you. Number one, other states that have done what we're doing or a similar version, which is to say every single state in the country since about the middle of March. What we're doing, I'd love to take credit for the ingenuity of it, but I can't. It's been done by Idaho and Nebraska and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and other states that have had primaries since or are about to have primaries. Most of those are red states. I'm doing what other Republican chief election officials are doing. But what they've seen in their turnout, the ones that have had elections so far under this sort of approach, is they've had election turnout either be about what it's been historically in this sort of a cycle, a presidential primary election, or they've seen turnout go up. The turnout is a little more static on the Republican side. And I think that's somewhat due to the stigmatization of absentee balloting that's unfortunately prevalent in many Republican circles. But you see higher Democratic turnout because Democrats ideologically are more comfortable with mail-in elections. It's actually part of their policy platform. And so if I had to guess, I'm not in a position to guess yet, I think we'll see much higher Democratic turnout than Republican turnout. They've got a Senate race that's seen as possibly competitive. The Republican race for the U.S. Senate is not seen as competitive in their primary. Both parties have their presidential nominations locked up. So my guess is you'll see higher Democratic turnout. I also think you'll see higher turnout in urban counties for this simple reason. It's much easier for me to explain these rules and to promote this voting system in the urban areas. They're just better suited to getting information right now under the circumstances. I do half a dozen Zooms a day. I do countless media interviews. I'm on television everywhere, but it's hard to reach the nooks and crannies of rural Kentucky right now. Most of the calls my office gets, we get hundreds of calls a day, people wanting information about the election, and they tend to be disproportionately from the rural areas where people have a real lack of clarity about the rules. They're just not getting the information. And I'm really concerned about people showing up at the polls that day unnecessarily and having long lines and people getting sick. So my guess, long answer to your question, I think we'll have pretty high turnout in Jefferson and Fayette. I think it's going to be lower elsewhere. My guess is ultimately we'll have turnout probably in the ballpark of 25%. That may be lowballing it. So typically in a primary, it's about 15, 20%. I think it'll be a little higher overall because of the absentee option.
And you mentioned Secretary Adams observing other states that have sort of been there, done that, had primaries before Kentucky. On the tail end, as we're processing these returns, whether they're absentee ballots or the in-person or the drop-offs, sort of what have the lessons been learned as you are watching these other states processing the ballots? And perhaps you can comment on the process, but then also what can we expect on Election Day as the returns are being reported out?
Sure. Well, let me give you an example of Wisconsin. I think, sorry to pick on Wisconsin, but they've set the standard for what all of us are trying to avoid in a couple of ways. One way is you had a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature going at it in the courts, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, actually. You had branches of government going after each other, Democrats and Republicans going after each other. And that has two negative effects. One is it makes people feel like the election rules are a game and people are trying to rig the rules to help their own side. And that reduces public confidence in our process. The other problem, maybe even a greater problem with that, is it took until literally Election Day before people knew what the rules were going to be. And a lot of people got disenfranchised. A lot of people who thought that there was just going to be in-person voting didn't realize where the sites were going to be, had lack of clarity and so forth. They missed their chance to vote. They could have voted absentee and they missed out, et cetera. Or they showed up and waited in line 5 or 6 hours in Milwaukee and then gave up and went home. So to me, it was very important to work with the governor in a bipartisan way months in advance to reach an agreement about the rules, to have a bipartisan compromise so the Democrats and Republicans could feel confident that this wasn't rigged to help one side or the other. But also to have decisions made well in advance so that everyone knew the rules going in and could work around that. So you asked about the counting process. Wisconsin, they actually set their process legally to not announce any election results until a week after the election. We're not doing that here. We're going to allow results to trickle out as we have them. My expectation is that certain parts of the state will have results faster than others, and here's why. To the extent people vote absentee and they do so early, which is to say they don't wait till the last minute to mail in or return a ballot, absentee ballot, it's going to enable us to count the results much, much more quickly. So if jurisdictions have a lot of ballots returned very late, it's going to take days and days, potentially a week to count them all. And we're going to have candidates and their supporters left in suspense about the results. My policy is we're going to be releasing information as soon as we have it. We don't call races. That's what the media do. We just offer information, offer results. We're going to have a pretty good sense of how many votes are outstanding through election night. We're not going to have precinct reporting because we're not going to have the typical precincts, but we are going to release an estimate of the percentage of votes that have been cast based on the requests or absentee ballots. We're going to see how many are outstanding yet to be returned and how many we have. My expectation is that the counties where people get their ballots in fairly promptly, so we can tabulate them promptly, including before election day itself. We authorize that so that we don't have backlogs of processing. We're not going to announce any results until the polls close at 6 p.m. election night, but the counties that got their votes in quicker are going to have results quicker. And for the other ones, it may take several days. We may have some races that are so close it takes a week to know the results.
Great, thank you for that. And don't need to jump too far ahead, but we're getting a couple of questions about how these changes and process and procedure could impact the November general election. So any thoughts, comments, predictions on some changes that we can anticipate moving forward?
Well, sure. I'll let the governor speak for himself, but in my conversations with him, our understanding has been, let's learn from June 23rd and let's see what works and doesn't. I think it's premature to begin setting a plan forth for November for a couple of reasons. Number one, we need to see how June 23rd goes and learn lessons from that. I'll be very frank and say, I don't know if what we're doing for June 23rd is the perfect system. I know it's the only one we have available under the circumstances. I hope that it works well. You're going to have human error. You're going to have voter confusion. We have that every single election regardless. We're certainly going to have it here. We're going to learn from that experience, and we're also going to wait and see what the fall looks like with regard to coronavirus. I know the governor certainly doesn't want us to be a closed state that deep in the future with the government offices closed. That's the last thing that he wants or any of us want. So my expectation is to have a regular election in November. That's certainly our goal. I think the governor's goal as well is to not be in a state of emergency at that time. I will add that yesterday I was sued by the ACLU and other liberal organizations. Their lawsuit in part aims to have a judge order me to reintroduce for November the exact same election system we have for June. I guess I'm flattered that they have so much confidence in what we came up with, but I think it's premature for me to decide what the election should look like, let alone to be ordered by a judge as to what the election should look like.
I know that your office and you have been on the record and the media has been reporting about the proposal of the one polling location within Jefferson County. For those that have not been following, do you want to kind of comment and give us sort of the latest on the circumstances here in Louisville and Jefferson County?
Yeah, sorry for the tease earlier. This is what I wanted to come to, but this is probably the number one issue that I get upset calls about right now. So let me say a couple things. First of all, we have a great county clerk and a great election team in Jefferson County. Bobby Holzclaw, Mary Ellen Allen, Frank Friday. They're outstanding public servants. I've worked with them all in other capacities over the years. They have a heart for service, and they're doing their best under very difficult circumstances. Second, I disagree with their recommendation to the State Board of Elections to just have one polling site. The governor and I, in our negotiations, we agreed to significantly reduce the number of polling sites, but not eliminate them entirely. We've got much, much smaller counties that have many more sites intended than Jefferson has. Franklin County has 3. Jessamine, I believe, has 4 or 6. We have counties that are much smaller that have managed to find a way to have multiple voting locations. I'll keep confidence is confidential, but I've been working directly with the clerk's office this week to try to explain some misunderstandings that they had about what the rules require. And I'm hoping that with those misunderstandings corrected, they'll be able to produce more sites for the election. This is not something that I control. I've got at best the power of persuasion, but under state law, the county clerks decide how many polling sites there are and where they are, and the State Board of Elections approves or doesn't approve those plans. That's how this agreement between the governor and I works We didn't suspend that law. That's how it's going to work for that too. The State Board of Elections to date has not approved Jefferson County's plan. It's the subject of some discussion, as you might expect. I'm expecting the Board of Elections to convene probably next week and take up these county plans, not just with regard to voting locations, but also the plans for what Election Day looks like, how people are going to be spaced apart and kept healthy and so forth. So I respect the hard work they're doing. Let me make a quick general point. Some people are saying as a criticism, and I completely understand it, why in the heck are you guys reducing the number of polling locations and creating bigger crowds on Election Day if your goal is to avoid big crowds? There's a certain logic there. Here's the problem. This is a bug, not a feature of our elections. We didn't want to have fewer locations. We have fewer locations for 3 reasons. Number one, we don't have the locations. The locations are not volunteering to be locations under the circumstances. It's a liability risk. Who wants to put their church or their school up to have thousands of people from the general public show up they don't know and can't control, who may or may not be healthy, who may or may not have masks on? Who wants that in exchange for a small rental fee? Very few locations, I can assure you. In a normal election, we have some 3,687 locations. Some of our locations are nursing homes. We're not using those. So number one, we just didn't have enough locations as a general matter. Number two, we don't have enough PPE. These locations are all in competition for PPE, and they're in competition with state agencies, local governments. They're in competition with businesses that are trying to reopen, retail and restaurants and so forth that need PPE. So we don't have enough to go around. We had to have fewer locations for that reason. The final reason is we don't have enough poll workers. A typical election requires some 15,000 poll workers, the vast majority of whom are elderly. Those are just the people exactly who are at most risk from coronavirus. There are people who, if they did ever volunteer previously this year to be poll workers, they've largely canceled. We've extended the deadline repeatedly for poll workers. The statutory deadline for appointment of poll workers is March 20th. We waived that till April 24th. Then we waived it till May 15th. We may waive it again. We just don't have enough poll workers. So if you don't have enough poll workers or enough locations or enough PPE, you just can't have a traditional election. This is not Home Depot or Kroger. We don't have 4,000 Krogers and Home Depots in the state. And if we did, they would be Home Depot and Kroger. We just don't have, despite what you see in the meme, the locations available for traditional election.
Thank you for that explanation. Can you tell us about Senate Bill 2 and how it will affect elections and voting this year?
Sure. So the primary issue I ran on was requiring a photo ID to vote in our elections. Our neighboring states have it. States around the country, red states, blue states have photo ID laws. I felt that it was something that we should have here in Kentucky as well. I was successful in first winning the election and then drafting and passing again over the governor's veto, Senate Bill 2. I then got the pleasure of signing it into law personally. Under our law, the Secretary of State signs bills that have been enacted over a veto. So I was very proud of that. Let me tell you a couple things on that. First of all, the lawsuit I referred to a moment ago seeks to not invalidate that law, but simply to have it postponed in implementation until after COVID-19 goes away. I'm actually pleased by that for this reason. I see that as a concession that this law, generally speaking, is constitutional. I went very far out of my way working with the same people who sued me yesterday, the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, and others, doing a lot of outreach to left-leaning organizations, having them come to my office repeatedly, getting their take. I've worked with them on other issues as well, ways to make it easy to vote and so forth. So I worked with them. I'm a little disappointed that they sued me without any prior notice. But in any event, I expect to have a normal election. I expect to have this law implemented. I intend to vigorously defend it in my capacity, both as a public official who's been sued, but also as an election attorney with a significant experience in that field. But let me note this too. If we find ourselves in a situation in November where it's just simply not feasible to have a photo ID requirement, I've shown myself to be a reasonable person who's willing to take off my own party and make accommodations where they're the only responsible alternative. I will do the same thing with this, but we're not there yet. It's premature for a lawsuit to sue me to strike down my bill, and it's premature for a lawsuit to sue me to rewrite our election code for November entirely. But if we do find ourselves in November and just simply unable to have a photo ID law in place, we've got two escape valves. Number one, the emergency powers law of our state allows me and the governor to jointly agree to change election rules, and I would be willing to assess that if necessary as to application of this law. Again, it's not my preference, but I would if I had to. Number two, the way that we actually wrote the law is there's a reasonable impediment provision. If a voter's not able to produce a photo ID because they can't get one, they can actually note that when they vote, and then they can provide a non-photo ID and still cast a ballot just like any other voter. We already have a non-photo ID law in our state. That law then takes, that process takes precedence for a voter who can't get a photo ID. And so I was very reasonable in listening to adversaries and crafting this law, and I think it's going to be workable without regard to coronavirus. But even if we have it still ongoing, this law will still work. People can still vote without a photo ID.
Thank you, Secretary Adams. I know that we're running low on time here, and so just in closing, are there any other actions that your office is taking in response to the pandemic that businesses and the general public need to know, therefore, so GLI can help get the word out?
Well, this is a little dry and technical, but actually before the election plan, most of the calls I got weren't about elections. They were about business issues, specifically notarizations. It's been very difficult, I'm sure, for a lot of your members to buy and sell property, to engage in legal functions without the ability to notarize documents. So first, back in March, I used my position to strongly encourage our clerks to remain open to the public, even if indirectly, to find novel ways through best practices that I offered for how the clerks could transact business with the public, swear in notaries and perform notarizations and so forth under the circumstances. I also signed into law a regulation a couple of weeks ago that makes it easier for people to e-notarize documents, which is to say to have a notary verify identity and notarize a document through a Zoom or a similar method. We're hoping, at least on the margins, that will help our Kentucky businesses. It's frustrating to see all that Congress has done to help businesses with the CARES Act, and then to see these logistical hurdles in their path as they're trying to do business and put people back to work. So I'm very proud that our office has also been responsible on the business front. Some preliminary numbers I've gotten from my business staff is that we actually have seen an uptick in business filings. Kentuckians are a resilient people. We've actually seen people start or restart businesses that had been fallow before. We're an entrepreneurial people, and people are responding to the circumstances by taking risks as entrepreneurs. I'm proud of them for that.
Well, thank you, Secretary Adams, for your time today. I'm sure you thought, in the first year of office that you would be running an election right in the middle of the pandemic, but we really value your leadership and your willingness to connect with the region's business community to walk us through all of this. I have 3:30 on my clock now, so out of respect for everyone's time and the Secretary's time, we'll bring today's call to an end. I want to thank Babbage co-founder for presenting this call today. Couldn't do it without you, and Secretary Adams on behalf of GLI. Thank you so much for speaking with us today and answering our questions. We wish you the best of luck over the next few months here as you guide Kentuckian citizens through this very unique and different election cycle. With that, thanks to everyone for joining the call, and we are now adjourned.